For reaction and analysis on the crime stats, we're joined now by Lizette Lancaster. She's from the Institute of Security Studies. Thank you very much for joining us, Lizette. So the murder rate increased by 1.4% in the year under review, with 21,325 people being killed. What's your take on that particular stats, and have you looked at it like on a provincial basis? What are the key takeaways from that stat?
Thank you. Yes, so those are actually the raw incidents of murder. So we now have 21,325 murders in that financial year of 1 April 2019 to end of March this year. That means 58 people on average a day were being murdered. Of course, that is 303 more murders than last year. But I suppose the little silver lining is that the murder rate, that is the number of murders per 100,000 population, has remained relatively stable at about 36 murders per 100,000. Now, of course, that's nothing to celebrate, except that it seems that there's a bit of a stabilization. Of course, the international murder rate is about 6 murders per 100,000 population, so it just shows you how far we are off. I think for me, the most worrying bit is that over the past 8 years, we've seen a 37% increase in the number of murders. And that is especially, we've seen very high murder rates in provinces like Gauteng, in Western Cape. But this year, we've seen a 10.6% increase in the number of murders in KwaZulu-Natal, as well as a 5% increase in the number of murders for Mpumalanga, whereas it's pretty stable for the other provinces. So that, to me, was the standout of the murder figures.
So South Africa continues to be plagued by gender-based violence, which includes sexual offences. Those were up by 20.5%. We know that the government has announced interventions, but it doesn't really seem to be changing the situation that much. Your thoughts?
Yes, look, this is a very complex issue and one that we are still trying to unpack even during this lockdown. We must remember these crime statistics are now already 4 months out of date because it ran to end of March, just before the lockdown. Fortunately, the minister has indicated that we'll see the release of the first quarter of this year or of the financial year from April to end of July, so end of today, shortly. So we'll be able to see what's happening with these figures during the lockdown. But we know traditionally many of these incidents are not reported to the police. When we look at the victims of crime survey, we know that sometimes as low as 50% of assaults are reported to the police. So it is very difficult to make sense of the sexual offences, gender-based violence, because we don't always know what proportion is actually, or can we attribute to it actually increasing the number of incidents, or whether it is that more and more people are reporting these incidents. But we know when we look at the crime statistics and murder, the most reliable crime stat, that out of those 59 murders a day, about 7 of them are women, and about 3 of them are children. And that is very concerning.
Yeah, no, it is a huge worry indeed. But now, you know, this whole issue of the gender-based violence, and now they have added the category of femicide as well. It is quite tricky because it would seem that it really needs socialization in terms of how men treat women. Because if I'm with a man and I'm there voluntarily and he decides to kill me, you know, it's behind closed doors. It's a very difficult thing to police. And the minister was talking about how they're getting SAPS personnel to be trained up in this area. You can be trained up, but you're not going to be between those 4 walls.
Yes, unfortunately, we see that most of the violent crimes are actually happening in private spaces, in residences, either of the victim or the perpetrator, or, of course, where they live together. And that has always made it difficult. That actually proves the fact that we need to look at other avenues in order to address this. You know, in places like Kenya, types of school curriculum to address this misogyny and the different perceptions of men and women have been quite successful. There are many, many things we can do, starting with our children, to teach respect for one another and to really start with addressing violence at a very early age. Now, of course, what we do know is that where the police can play a significant role is making sure that they take all cases reported to them seriously, such as if there's an assault reported by neighbours or by the woman herself, that those are taken seriously. Too often we've seen it as being regarded, whether by CPFs or the police, as a private matter that needs to be resolved. But we know that these things can escalate into femicide, and we cannot take initial cases and not treat them seriously. They have to be, and this is where the police can really play a role, and we need to make sure that they record these cases and that they do take them seriously and that protection orders are available where required.
So cash in transit heists, they came down by 10.4%. Is that a product of anything that the police are doing, or what does it speak to?
I think it speaks to the partnerships that we've been seeing. We have been seeing task force that deal with cash in transit, the companies that transport the money, private security, the police, businesses. So you see this as one of the success stories where if there are these focus areas, this decisive partnerships, we can get on board with, or we can get to deal with robberies. But of course, there are other robberies that haven't fared so well. And this is the problem. Robberies are highly policeable and highly dependent on intelligence gathering and on partnerships.
Yeah. One does wonder why the police haven't used, CCTV systems in the longest of time. The police commissioner did talk about that, saying that's what they're going to be doing, using technology, and that there'll therefore be a lesser need to have, police feet on the ground, so to speak. Do you welcome that? And in terms of the impact on the resources of the police, if they're less on the ground, do you think that they would be deployable elsewhere?
I think that is one of the strategies that can work, but we have to really also learn from international experiences. We know that intelligence gathering is still the most important thing. So that together with, say, CCTV cameras. But we must also remember that many of these cameras that we have in our communities now are not necessarily, they're great deterrents, but they are not necessarily great for intelligence gathering, because very often one cannot see clearly and so forth. So you need this combination of really smart policing, looking at the patterns, looking at the modus operandi, where these things happen, why they are happening, what times. And we've seen from a lot of the point data, if we look at where crimes happen in certain areas, that they happen in fairly few or localized areas in certain times of the day. So it's that type of intelligence that we need, that type of analysis at a station level, that then together with these type of technologies can help. But we also need to just be careful that we don't see technology as the salvation of our crime problem, because as we've established, they're not in every house. They are also not, they are as good as what they can recognize, who they can see. And there's been a lot of problems in countries like the US with, say, facial recognition software programs and such. So one has to really make sure that you have decent evidence when you employ these type of things, and that you monitor whether it's really working or not and adjust strategies if they are not found to be working properly.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. At the end of the day, you can have the technology there, but you need the human interpretation in order to convert that into a good prosecution. Now, what are your thoughts about how we're doing in South Africa at the SAPS level in terms of gathering evidence properly such that there are positive prosecutions down the line?
We have seen a number of changes in the national prosecuting authorities. We have seen prosecutor-led interventions. We are seeing them employing more type of pilot programs for, say, trio crimes, which is the house robberies, carjackings, and the business robberies, the crimes we fear the most often. So it is about those partnerships being strengthened. We still see that there are problems with the dockets, that they are not necessarily court ready. So, but we have also seen improvement programs in the police to deal and address these type of investigative weaknesses. So it is very, very dependent on the caliber of the investigators, the cooperation between the different agencies. We've seen successes at high profile levels with the Hawks, for instance. So we're encouraged. There's definitely moves in and strategies in the right direction. But of course, we are sitting with a huge bulk of crime, and it's not helping that, you see carjackings, for instance, increasing and business robberies still increasing. The crimes that really put the fear of in all of us.
One last thing before I let you go. In terms of the quarterly releases, when the police do release, the first quarter of the financial year, that is April to the end of June, it's going to be a very kind of non-event type of stats. I mean, people were all stuck at home. Very few crimes were committed. It's going to be a very interesting set of statistics.
It is going to be an interesting set of statistics. Now, look, we applaud the police because we've been calling for this for many years. At least then communities will have real-time crime statistics almost. The problem is that that was an anomaly. We had this lockdown that meant, and curfews that meant most of us couldn't move. So it would be interesting to see how, what crimes still thrive during this very restrictive period. However, unfortunately, the crimes that we won't necessarily pick up are the organized crimes that we have seen around cigarettes, liquor, and those type of crimes that still thrive, especially because markets have been created. But I think beyond that, we are seeing the second quarter hopefully being released in November, which will be a very critical quarter because we have seen increases, quite sharp increases at certain crimes, very often from what we experience and what we hear in our communities. So it's very important to have a very close eye on these statistics, given the economic downturn and given just how policing resources are often now redirected to lockdown or restriction enforcement rather than the robberies that scare us.
Yeah. Lizette, thank you so much for talking to us this afternoon. That was Lizette Lancaster. She's from the Institute of Security Studies. The Revenue Service